The guards expected defiance. The prisoners expected punishment. No one expected a classroom. It began on an ordinary morning in 1944, inside an American POW camp built miles away from any coastline or city, surrounded only by endless stretches of farmland and sky. German prisoners marched out for roll call, boots crunching over cold earth, guarded by American soldiers who had been told these men were dangerous, unpredictable, remnants of Hitler's war machine. But that morning, something changed. A prisoner in his late 30s, thin, spectacled, carrying himself like someone who once belonged to a lecture hall instead of a battlefield, stepped away from the line. The guards tensed instantly, hands hovering near rifles. He didn't raise his hands. He didn't try to run. He simply held out a small booklet. A grammar guide. He spoke slowly, carefully. "I can teach English, if anyone wishes to learn." Silence fell across the yard. Guards exchanged confused glances. Prisoners stared, waiting. The camp sergeant almost dismissed him. But one of the younger guards, barely 20, weary from war and lacking a proper education, hesitated. He stepped forward, took the booklet, and nodded. That single nod shattered the rules of the war inside that camp. Within days, makeshift lessons began in the corner of a barack. Then more prisoners joined, offering mathematics, carpentry, agriculture, engineering. Skills they once used in factories, universities, and village schools before being drafted. American guards, at first skeptical, watched from afar. But curiosity is a powerful force. Soon, 2 guards stood by the doorway listening. Then 3. Then more. The improvised classroom grew beyond one room. POWs became teachers. Guards became students. Knowledge flowed through the camp fence in both directions, creating something the war had tried to bury. Humanity. This was the camp where enemy lines blurred, where foreign hands held chalk instead of weapons, where men who once tried to kill each other now passed notebooks and shook hands after lessons. This is the story of how a POW camp transformed into a place where enemies did the unthinkable. They learned from each other. When the first groups of German prisoners arrived in the United States in 1943 and 1944, they were shocked by what they saw. Many had been warned by Nazi officers that capture by Americans meant brutality, starvation, humiliation, death, even. Yet the sprawling rural camps across the Midwest and South looked nothing like the horrors they'd been told to expect. Camp Millridge, the setting of this story, was one of those places. Built quickly on open farmland, it consisted of long wooden barracks, open yards, guard towers at each corner, and a mess hall that always smelled faintly of coffee and boiled potatoes. Winters were cold. Summers were blistering. But what struck both guards and prisoners alike was the emptiness around it. No nearby towns. No escape. Nothing but fields stretching out in every direction. For the Americans stationed there, the assignment was a mix of boredom and tension. Many were older reservists or younger soldiers recovering from injuries, men deemed unfit for overseas deployment. They were told their job was simple: supervise the prisoners, enforce the rules, and maintain order. They were never told what to do when order shifted into something entirely unexpected. The German POWs brought their own complicated histories. Among them were former farmers, machinists, bakers, musicians, and engineers. A surprising number had university degrees. A few had been schoolteachers before the draft swept them into a war they didn't choose. Some remained fiercely loyal to the collapsing Reich. Others were simply tired, disillusioned, and grateful to be alive. The Geneva Convention allowed prisoners to work, and so the camp ran on their labor. POWs chopped timber, repaired fences, harvested crops, and assisted in local canneries. The work was tiring but fair, and many prisoners preferred it to idleness. Still, the long hours created a silent ache, days filled with physical toil but barren of mental purpose. Everything changed when the camp commander approved the creation of a small library. It was meant to keep the prisoners occupied, nothing more. But the moment shelves were installed and books donated by nearby townsfolk, something sparked inside the camp. Prisoners browsed the titles with reverence: English dictionaries, algebra primers, American history books, carpentry manuals, agricultural guides, and even a few dog-eared novels. They devoured the material. Within a week, some began organizing the books. Within 2, they proposed creating study groups. The guards laughed at the idea at first. School? In a POW camp? It sounded absurd. But the German prisoners persisted. They asked for pencils, scrap paper, chalk. They rearranged a baroque corner into a makeshift classroom. Wooden crates became desks. Chalkboards were scavenged from old storage rooms. Every morning before work detail, men gathered to read or debate topics as though they hadn't been soldiers a few months earlier. It didn't take long for a few curious American guards to wander over. One young guard, Private Lawson, paused during patrol when he overheard 2 POWs discussing mathematics. He had struggled in school himself and found the conversation strangely compelling. When one of the prisoners offered to explain an equation, Lawson surprised himself by stepping inside the barack. That moment cracked open the barrier between us and them. Soon, more guards drifted in, quietly at first, pretending to check windows or inspect bunks. Then more honestly, leaning over chalkboards to ask questions. English classes became two-way exchanges. POWs learned American slang. Guards learned German grammar. Agriculture lessons expanded into discussions about European soil and crop rotation. Mechanics shared tricks for repairing engines with limited equipment. The camp commander watched all this with raised eyebrows. "This wasn't in the manual," he muttered. But the atmosphere inside Camp Millridge began to shift. Tension eased. Mutual respect quietly replaced suspicion. Days no longer felt like an endless march of routine. They carried purpose. Shared purpose. Of course, not everyone approved. A few guards felt uncomfortable with the growing closeness. Some prisoners, especially those still loyal to the Reich, viewed the classes as betrayal. They whispered among themselves, warning others not to trust the Americans' kindness. Yet many prisoners ignored the warnings, hungry for knowledge that could rebuild their lives after the war. Because deep down, they knew something that war often hides. Learning makes strangers feel familiar. Teaching turns enemies into humans. And knowledge, once shared, becomes a bridge no barbed wire can block. What began as quiet curiosity soon grew into something far larger. So large that it drew attention from people who had never cared about the inside of a POW camp before. By late 1944, Camp Millridge had transformed. The once quiet yard now buzzed with activity at dawn. Groups of prisoners gathered around chalkboards, discussing equations or practicing English phrases. Guards leaned against doorframes, listening as farmers explained soil acidity or former mechanics described how to repair tractor engines with improvised tools. Evenings were filled with murmurs of debate. History, literature, politics, engineering. Subjects rarely heard in the middle of wartime captivity. This new world inside the camp felt fragile, almost unbelievable. That fragility showed itself when an unexpected visitor arrived. Major Sinclair, an inspector from the regional command, stepped through the gates one cold morning. Tall, rigid, skeptical by nature, he viewed the camp with a soldier's eye, searching for anything out of order. And the first thing he noticed was silence during roll call. Not fear, not tension, just calm cooperation, which made him suspicious immediately. He toured the barracks with a clipboard, questioning guards, studying work logs. When he entered the converted classroom, he froze. 30 German prisoners sat in rows, taking notes while a POW at the front explained the fundamentals of American civics in accented English. Worse still, 2 American guards were seated among them, notebooks in hand. Sinclair's jaw locked. "What exactly is happening here?" he asked, voice cutting through the room. No one answered at first. The camp sergeant stepped forward awkwardly. "Sir, they're teaching." "Teaching?" The word sounded like an insult coming from Sinclair. "Teaching what?" "How to escape. How to sabotage." One of the POWs, a former teacher, rose slowly. "With respect, sir. We are learning. All of us." Sinclair's glare could have frozen water. "Prisoners don't dictate their activities. This ends immediately." The room fell silent as he ordered the classes paused pending evaluation. Chalkboards were removed. Books were locked away. Guards were reprimanded. The library was temporarily closed. The atmosphere changed overnight. The camp, once filled with cautious optimism, felt suffocated again. POWs worked in silence. Guards avoided the barracks. Even the commander seemed uneasy, as though something precious had been taken away. But war has a way of reminding people what truly matters. 2 weeks after Sinclair's inspection, a violent thunderstorm tore through the region. Floodwaters rose rapidly around the farmland surrounding the camp. A nearby levee broke, endangering livestock and equipment stored by local farmers who depended on POW labor. The commander had no choice. He authorized the prisoners to help. As the rain poured, POWs and guards worked side by side, hauling sandbags, reinforcing collapsing structures, salvaging tools. The former professor directed structural efforts. The mechanic organized repair teams. The farmer assessed soil damage. Their expertise turned chaos into control. Sinclair, unfortunately for him, had chosen that day to revisit the camp. He arrived soaked, furious, demanding to know why prisoners were running operations. But even he couldn't argue with results. The flood damage was contained because the POWs used the very skills they had been teaching in those classrooms. That night, something shifted inside the commander. He summoned Sinclair and spoke plainly. "Major, if these men want to learn, and if that learning makes the camp safer, calmer, and more productive, we'd be fools to stop it." Sinclair scowled but couldn't refute the evidence. He left with a warning, but not an order. The ban was lifted. And what happened next surprised everyone. The guards, no longer hiding their interest, began arriving in groups. One wanted to read American literature. Another needed help understanding a blueprint. A sergeant asked for help improving his writing. Classes expanded so quickly the commander had to allocate an unused storage hut as a second schoolroom. By winter, Camp Millridge officially had a language room, a mathematics class, a mechanical workshop, an agricultural training area, a small orchestra formed by POW musicians, a library run jointly by guards and prisoners. But while harmony grew inside, pressure grew outside. Newspapers began reporting on overly lenient POW camps. Some local citizens felt threatened by the idea of Germans living comfortably on American soil. Rumors spread that the camp was giving prisoners too much freedom. Sinclair's superiors sent letters. Officials demanded stricter oversight. Some even suggested closing the classes. The commander resisted gently at first, then firmly. "Education has kept this camp peaceful," he wrote in his report. "It has transformed morale. It has prevented violence. If knowledge is a threat, then peace itself is a threat." The War Department didn't appreciate the tone. Inspections increased. Restrictions tightened. Whispers spread among prisoners that the classes could be shut down again. And tensions inside the camp rose. One night, a group of POWs loyal to the Reich confronted the teacher who ran the English class. They accused him of collaborating with the enemy, calling the lessons shameful. Guards intervened before violence erupted, but the message was clear. Not everyone wanted peace. Not everyone wanted learning. Not everyone wanted to see enemies become something else. The camp stood at a crossroads, and the moment of decisive conflict was approaching. A moment that would determine whether the schoolrooms survived the war or were erased forever. The breaking point came on a cold January morning, the kind where frost clung to every wooden plank of the barracks and the air felt tense even before dawn assembly. Something was wrong. Everyone sensed it. Guards whispered in pairs. Prisoners stood in tighter groups than usual. Even the camp dogs paced nervously. At sunrise, the commander called an emergency gathering in the central yard. A heavy silence fell as he stepped onto the small platform normally used for announcements. He looked older than he had days before, eyes shadowed with worry. "We received a telegram last night," he began. "A directive from Washington." Every guard stiffened. Every prisoner held their breath. He continued, voice steady but grim. They want the educational program shut down. Immediately, a murmur rippled through the camp. The prisoners who had once been teachers, mathematicians, engineers, linguists, lowered their heads. The American guards who had sat in their classes felt their stomachs drop. The commander cleared his throat. I disagree with the order. Strongly. But they want a full inspection. Everything must stop until they arrive. He stepped down. For the first time since the classes began, Camp Millridge felt like a cage again. That afternoon, tensions boiled over. In Barrack 12, the same Nazi loyalist faction that had harassed the English teacher decided now was their moment. They wanted control. They wanted fear restored. And more than anything, they wanted the learning to end, not just because of ideology, but because it gave power to prisoners they no longer influenced. As the English teacher gathered his books in silence, one of the loyalists blocked his path. No more classes, the man hissed. You made us look weak. Another prisoner stepped forward. Enough. We all benefited. You're traitors, the loyalist growled. The teacher tried to pass, but the loyalist shoved him hard. Books scattered across the floor. Chalk dust rose like smoke. A confrontation was seconds from turning violent. A whistle shrieked outside. Boots thundered against wooden steps. Two guards burst into the barrack, rifles slung but not raised. They saw the overturned bench, the fists clenched, the teacher trembling. What's going on? One demanded. The room froze. The loyalist glared but stepped back. No one spoke. No one had to. The guards helped the teacher gather his books. One of them, Lawson, the young guard who had been the first student, picked up a fallen grammar guide and dusted it off. You okay? He asked softly. The teacher nodded, though his voice shook. For now. Lawson looked around the room, then said something that surprised even him. Class isn't over. The POWs looked up, startled. We'll find a way, the guard added quietly. Just not here. That night, the camp held its breath. The inspection team was due in the morning. The commander expected strict enforcement, harsh questioning, maybe even punishment for allowing the classes to grow so freely. He paced in his office, struggling between obedience and conviction. His entire career rested on what happened next. Meanwhile, inside the barracks, something remarkable unfolded. Guards and prisoners came together, quietly, cautiously, but with unmistakable unity. Instead of sleeping, they dismantled the classrooms. Chalkboards were removed. Books were boxed. Desks reverted to crates. Every trace of learning vanished, as if it had never existed. But the spirit remained. By lantern light, prisoners taught in whispers. Guards memorized lessons. Knowledge flowed hand to hand, spoken so softly it barely rose above the crackle of the lantern wicks. The camp became a secret school. Not authorized. Not visible. But unstoppable. Even the loyalist faction remained still, sensing the camp was united against them. Just before dawn, the improvised classrooms had completely dissolved. The camp looked like any other POW facility. Ordinary, controlled, silent. And then the inspectors arrived. They combed through barracks, interrogated guards, questioned prisoners, examined work logs. Everything looked normal. Too normal. One inspector, sharp-eyed and skeptical, turned to the commander. There are rumors of unauthorized teaching, he said. The commander's voice was calm. Rumors always spread in camps, sir. And guards attending those classes, the inspector pressed. None that I'm aware of. Are you hiding something, Commander? A long pause filled the room. The commander's hands tightened behind his back. And then, no, he said. I am not. His lie was not for deception. It was for protection. Satisfied, or at least lacking proof, the inspectors closed their notebooks. We will report the camp as compliant, the lead inspector said. And just like that, the danger dissolved. That evening, when the inspectors drove away, the camp exhaled as one. POWs emerged quietly from barracks. Guards stood nearby, pretending not to acknowledge them. But everyone shared the same unspoken emotion. Victory. The commander walked into the yard, cleared his throat, and addressed them all. "I cannot officially authorize classes," he said. Faces fell. He continued, "But I cannot stop what happens after work hours. So long as there is order." The prisoners exchanged hopeful glances. "And if crates happen to be arranged in rows," he added, "I suppose there's no rule against that." A ripple of relieved laughter spread through the yard. The school was back. Unofficial. Unwritten. Undefeated. Spring arrived slowly at Camp Millridge, thawing the frost, softening the ground, and reshaping the atmosphere into something almost peaceful. The war was still raging across oceans, but inside the camp, something gentler had taken root. Something no directive from Washington could fully extinguish. The unofficial school blossomed. Every evening, crates quietly transformed into rows of seats. Chalkboards reappeared like ghosts returning to life. Books found their way back from boxes. Guards slipped in after their shifts, pretending they were just checking on things before taking a seat. Lessons resumed, not loudly, not boldly, but with quiet persistence. German farmers taught American guards how to analyze soil health and repair damaged irrigation systems. American soldiers demonstrated shorthand techniques and shared basics of U.S. law and local customs. A former architect taught geometric drawing. An engineer explained simple electrical circuits using whatever scrap wire he could find. The orchestra practiced in the far corner of the yard at dusk, soft melodies drifting through the fences like memories of better times. And something extraordinary happened. For the first time since the camp was built, the guards and prisoners lived without fear of each other. Not friendship, not forgiveness, but understanding, earned, fragile, real. Outside the camp, the world was falling apart. Cities were burning, armies retreating, ideologies collapsing. But inside the barbed wire, knowledge had woven a bond stronger than propaganda and more resilient than resentment. By early 1945, the war's end approached. News filtered in, Allied advances, German retreats, shattered cities, surrendered garrisons. And one morning, the message finally came: the war in Europe was over. The camp buzzed with a strange mix of relief and uncertainty. The prisoners would soon be repatriated. Some were eager to go home. Others feared what home meant now. And the guards, despite everything, realized they would miss the nightly lessons, the unexpected conversations, the shared hours that once felt impossible. Repatriation began slowly. POWs lined up with minimal belongings, stepping through the gates they had lived behind for years. But before each group left, something remarkable occurred. The guards gathered near the exit, not to supervise, but to say goodbye. They shook hands, exchanged notebooks, shared final phrases in each other's languages, pressed small gifts into palms, hand-carved chess pieces, folded lesson notes, pages filled with translations, sketches, or formulas. For a brief, fleeting moment, the camp felt less like a prison and more like a place where men had reclaimed a piece of themselves. The last teacher to leave paused at the gate. Turning back, he lifted a hand toward the barracks that had once been classrooms. The guards returned the gesture with quiet respect. When the gates closed behind the final group, Camp Millridge fell silent. But the silence did not feel like absence, it felt like memory. Years later, former prisoners wrote letters from rebuilt towns in Germany. They described how the skills they learned in captivity helped them rebuild farms, fix engines, reopen schools, restore communities. Guards wrote back, sharing how the classes had shaped their futures too, leading some to become teachers, engineers, or farmers themselves. For all its fences and watchtowers, Camp Millridge had done something extraordinary. It proved that even in war, enemies can become students and teachers, and in doing so, become human again. In the end, the lessons learned inside barbed wire outlasted the war that built it.